Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And in this episode of A View from Afar, political scientist and former Pentagon Analyst Paul Buchanan and I will deep dive into the US-Israel war in the Middle East. Specifically, we will discuss why did Netanyahu and Trump attack Iran and start this war? Why did the US decide to attack without a clear reason to do so and without strategic planning nor a legal argument for it? What impact will this war have in the Middle East have on US midterm elections? And what of independent operators in this conflict, such as European states? Why do they risk being drawn into this US-Israel Middle East war? But before we kick off this episode, first, remember, if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, in particular YouTube, feel free to comment, as we can include your comments and questions in this program. And especially, we encourage you to join us via YouTube, as YouTube has live interaction that is better than the other platforms in our view. So let's cross to Paul Buchanan, who's waiting online to discuss these issues. Paul, kia ora, Paul. How are you today?
Kia ora, Selwyn. I'm living in the land of the long white cloud, quite literally.
Yeah.
I'm sitting up at 700 meters above sea level, overlooking the Tasman Sea, and I'm in a cloud.
Wow.
And this is not fog. This is a cloud. It's actually a regular occurrence at certain times of years out here. But what it does do is obviously the humidity is off the charts. And we have constant pollen all year round. And so it aggravates my hay fever. And if people notice my red eye, I had a little surgery last week and it's more irritated than usual because of the pollen. But no worries, everything is otherwise fine. So yeah, I'm living in the cloud, and it ain't the cloud. There's no AI going on here.
No,
That's for sure.
I'm just looking out the window there. I've had issues all the way through this series, really, particularly last year with lighting, and so I've opened it up to the elements, Paul. So if I start bleaching out, like I'm out in the blue sky rays or something like that, that's exactly what's happening. Looking out the window there, it's totally blue sky. We're supposed to be having rain coming through this afternoon. Maybe a shower or two will come through during the episode, but it's not going to affect the dialogue, is it? So let's jump into this. In a lot of ways, all the noise and everything around this particular topic, this US-Israel war in the Middle East, and obviously this conflict is focused largely on Iran, but also we're going to discuss, aren't we, issues relating to the invasions of the southern parts of Lebanon, etc., and what that all means. A lot of clouds. We've mentioned clouds, and there's a lot of cloud of information around this whole issue. So, Paul, over to you. Let's structure and take this through.
Okay, there's three parts to what I'd like to say today. And again, if listeners want to chime in with their Q&As type things, I'm more than happy. Both Selwyn and I enjoy that sort of stuff. So, three parts. Part one, just to frame, especially for long-term listeners or readers of Geopolitical, the blog that I write. You may remember that we discussed at length, Selwyn, of course, is all over this, transitions. And we went from the bipolar world in 1990 to the unipolar world dominated by the United States, as of 1990 until around 2001, 2002. And that's where things get interesting, because one of the defining points of transitional moments is that conflict becomes the system's regulator. And the new emerging system that will come out of the transition from unipolarity to whatever else will be marked by conflict. And sure enough, this transitional moment, which is now coming to its conclusion, or at least its fruition, is started with the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Poorly thought out strategic blunders, as it turns out in both instances, done by presidents with a lot of hubris and not a lot of knowledge about what they were getting into. And I won't overuse the Vietnam analogy, but they got bogged down into ground wars of attrition in which the locals had the advantage because they were fighting on their own turf, and the Americans were involved in an expeditionary war that increasingly got unpopular. That's how this started, the move to multipolarity. And now we're reaching its fruition with this incredible blunder that is the United States at the instigation of Israel, basically aggressively attacking Iran under false pretenses. So let me get into that. But I thought for people who are more theoretically minded, the larger picture is that conflict marks the transition, the contours of it, and then the eventual outcomes. Because let's face it, I'll say it up front. The biggest loser in all of this is the United States. Uh, I never would have thought I'd say that, but the United States is not coming out of this with the stature it had before, and we know we can blame for that. We'll mention him in a second, but no, it's over. The era of unipolarity, but more important, so-called U.S. hegemony, it's done. Okay,
and earlier on too in previous series, Paul, we looked at and we kind of sniffed the breeze. What are we picking up, irrespective of one's ideology, irrespective of where our biases or our preferences may lie in geopolitical alignment and security and in intelligence areas? And it's something that you and I discussed, and you agreed when I put it to you, that the United States, irrespective of the Donald Trump phenomenon, shall we say, was becoming an unreliable security partner for small, Western-leaning democracies like New Zealand and many others. Even I would argue Australia. And it came out of that discussions relating to AUKUS. We don't need to reinvent that or re-examine that. But are we seeing the realities of that kind of discussion where the United States is not just an unreliable security partner, and perhaps we look to the Gulf states in that context, but also a dangerous one?
Oh, I would agree completely. I mean, the U.S., and again, very much in collusion with Israel, has gone rogue. And let me explain the hows, because part of this was to, go through the hows and whys. Now, I should say this to the listeners. Selwyn and I are not interested in discussing war porn or weapons fetishism. Okay? You guys, with the corporate media saturation that we even get down here, the gun sight videos, the constant bombings, we're not interested in that. You can find plenty of that elsewhere. And in fact, someone's even got some maps of targeting and everything should people want to see that. But here's the deal. Let's just talk about, the how and why. This, in a weird way, the decision to attack Iran, again, under false pretenses, and I'll enumerate why they are false, what is a double wag the dog scenario. And listeners may remember that when talking about the demise of authoritarian regimes, I had pointed out over the years that authoritarian regimes, one of the ways they die is they have domestic troubles at home. So they try to divert public attention into a foreign adventure that they think they can win easily. Case in point would be the Greek colonial regime of 1973 attacking Cyprus, the Argentines, of course, attacking the Malvinas Falklands in 1982. It resulted in their defeat and regime collapse. It was never envisioned that a democracy would stage a foreign diversion from mounting domestic troubles, but that's exactly what we got in the case of Donald Trump and the United States.
So you're saying because that a major compulsion is Donald Trump's troubles coming out of perhaps the Minnesota type of overreach with ICE, et cetera, that type of thing leading into this?
Yeah, and Epstein.
At Epstein.
Okay, and Epstein. I mean, I'm not getting into the Epstein stuff, but here's the deal. We'll start with the big player, Trump.
Yeah,
he has major troubles at home. His domestic policies are a failure. The tariffs have backfired for the most part. his MAGA movement is fracturing, in part because of U.S. support for Israel. All the anti-Semites in the right-wing part of U.S. politics have come out of the woodwork to denounce the support for Iran because they are, quite frankly, anti-Semitic. And in that, they share some tendencies with certain left wingers. But the point is, MAGA is breaking apart. See, there was the Make America Great part, who are now considered to be the globalists. That is, America is the world's policeman, and we kick rear and take names.
Yeah, yeah.
The other part is America First. What happened to No More Wars? What happened to,
Because they were the dominant, weren't they, as far as the public sphere discourse was concerned in the lead up to the elections, the presidential elections. That faction, the latter faction you're mentioning, was the dominant narrative. It was basically Trump's platform. We always knew that the more hawkish, globalized ideologies were within that camp, down the MAGA camp. But now we're seeing a conflict line, an area of abrasion, if you like, between the two. And you're saying it looks like he's got major troubles there within his MAGA constituency.
Absolutely. And it was seen this weekend at the CPAC conference,
Yes.
which I believe was held in Texas or Colorado. Anyway, there was open fractures, people arguing. And no, he's got major domestic problems. They can bluster all they want. But they're in dire strife, and it's a midterm election year. They're going to get hammered.
You mentioned CPAC. You mentioned CPAC there. Should we just expand that? Because my understanding is that there was a lot of attention, a lot in scope was Vance and Rubio, and it looked like Vance was starting to just climb above Rubio. What do you read just on that point? Sorry to jump in on this, but just a little bit of an insight in there.
Well, there's a couple of interesting signals. First of all, by featuring Vance and Rubio as potential rivals for the 2028 presidential nomination, they're signaling to all of us that Trump is done. Now, let's be very clear. Trump is visibly losing his grip. Why the media doesn't go front and center and say, Sir, you're falling asleep. Sir, you're talking about Sharpies and pens in the middle of a war you launched. Why don't they, call the emperor out and say, you got no clothes on, mate? Okay? He's a doddering fool. But they don't want to admit that. They bluster, they insult, they do those things, but they just signaled to us that he's done. But now it's Rubio and Vance. The second significant part is Vance should have been, the what do they call the prince who's about to become king? Whoever the next guy is.
The presumptive in other language, exactly.
Yeah, whatever that royal term is, but he's not. Vance has lots of detractors. Vance is now seen as a gross opportunist, as if Rubio is not, but Vance has changed his stripes so many times, from being a populist to now he's with the tech bros. He's Peter Thiel's pet project. And he's caught in the middle of those MAGA fractures.
Yeah.
So now we're starting to see Rubio elevated. I have no regard for Rubio whatsoever. He's Cuban American, but I happen to know very well his background as a Cuban American, given my background. And so, if he's the best of this sorry lot, the only good thing I can say is he will lose in 2028. But even if he wins, nothing can be worse than what we got now. I mean, absolutely not. Vance would have been semi-rational. But here's
mentioned
the key.
Peter. You mentioned Vance's support with Peter Thiel, and of course, one of the founders of Palantir. When we know that Palantir now is openly presenting, for example, that it has secured major military procurement deals in that AI kill chain space. That's its thing, isn't it? So I just wanted to put that into a context here as well. There are many tangents. Back to you, Paul.
Yeah, no, very good, and they're integrally tied into the Israeli military and intelligence networks. So it's hand in glove between Palantir and the Israelis. So what we have is Trump needs a diversion from his mounting domestic troubles because he believes that if he can get the idiots to follow him into war, then that he'll rally the crowd and he'll somehow rescue victory out of the jaws of defeat come November. But this is where the performative aspects of everything this White House does comes back to bite him in the rear end. He decides, okay, let's go after weaklings. So we go after the Maduro regime in Venezuela, which is unpopular. And let's just say the Venezuelan military is nowhere close to even the sharpest military in South America. It's got a lot of corrupt generals, armchair generals, and whatnot. So they do some backdoor dealing with Maduro's successors, find out they can cut a deal in which U.S. oil companies will be welcomed back. And the deal is Maduro is removed. We say yay. And then the U.S. deals economically more favorably with the Venezuelan successors. Forget about democracy. We'll talk a lot about democracy, but as soon as he's gone, we shut up about democracy. So that's what they did. It's pretty easy. They're now saber rattling at Cuba, same thing, although I can tell you from firsthand experience, the Cubans are a lot different than Venezuela. And if they think they can roll in there and do the same thing, Americans are going to die. I mean, they're going to die. But in between these two minnows and then threatening Greenland and doing all this other stuff, we have the second wag the dog scenario because on top of Trump looking for a diversion from his public troubles, and by the way, I agree with you 100%, ICE, Minnesota, the killing of Americans on American soil by these thugs. I mean, it's a bad ball of wax for the MAGA administration. So he's looking, and who's over there on the other side of the Atlantic? Very cunning Bibi Netanyahu. Bibi Netanyahu needs a diversion. Why? Because if he is not the prime minister of Israel during a state of emergency, he's in court. He's been staving off court appearances based on systemic fraud. The guy, it turns out, is a con man fraudster. Several members of his family, including his sons and his wife, have all been indicted. But he isn't, they can't take him to court because he's a sitting prime minister during a state of war. Well, Gaza has more or less ended. He's trying to prolong it. They obviously are going to make a go for the West Bank. They obviously have decided that southern Lebanon will be theirs, and I'll explain a little bit why that may be happening. But Iran, he needed to find something big because it's something that he could offer to Trump as a reaffirmation of their alliance, because they're two corrupt guys who are caught in this vice of domestic pressure. Because, let's be honest, I hate it when I see people blaming all Israelis for the sins of their right-wing government. There's a lot of liberal and leftist Israelis who don't want a bar of this, but they've been silenced. A lot of the press now ignores their protests. But let's just say Netanyahu would not be PM if there wasn't a war going on. He would have been... Okay,
so that's a bit of a backstory to this situation where we see the initiation of this conflict. We see it ratcheting up, and we see an excuse very quickly coming out of the state of Israel, Netanyahu's leadership there, saying this was preemptive. A lot of people in the West thought, oh, give us a break. This is a fig leaf of an excuse. Is there anything there that you would, we did major episodes on exactly what Iran was doing and its nuclear ambitions in the energy sector, whether or not it was developing weapons in that respect as well. I just cite that the United States President Donald Trump said that interest that Iran may have had with respect to nuclear weapons had been dealt to. So
Exactly.
where's the preemptive things? We did mention in previous episodes about the prospect of Iran being forced into dirty bombs. So there's something in that. But this is something that has a momentum that feels to many, I'd suggest, as wrong on every level of consideration for international law and conflict.
Yeah. Okay. So let me break down, because this is where the strategic differences between Israel and the United States become more apparent. First of all, just as an aside, I'll remind audiences again that preventative wars are not the same as preemptive wars. A preemptive war is an imminent threat is coming your way. And so you get out to neutralize it while it's on its way.
Mm.
A preventive war is you remove the opponent's capability to engage in preemption, right? So you take them out before they're a threat. This is a preventative war. Okay, it's not preemptive at all. There
And
was
where's its
no
legal
immediate.
status on that?
It's illegal.
Yeah.
You know, preemption is legal, prevention is not. I mean,
Yeah.
quite in the laws of war and what have you. So, but here's the interesting part. The U.S. has offered gibberish as its strategic rationale. It started out with what you just said. Oh, we got to take out their nuclear sites. Well, you told us last year that you obliterated them. That's Trump's words. And what? Now you got to go back and re-obliterate them? Come on. What are you
Mm.
talking about? So they either didn't do it then and don't want to admit their failure, or they're just talking, out of their rear ends. Then they say, because people question that, then they say, oh, but it's about they're the biggest state sponsored of terrorism on the earth. You're like, seriously? The Persians, the Iranians are Shia. The greatest acts of Muslim terrorism have been committed by Sunnis backed by the Saudi Arabians.
Yeah.
What do you mean they're the big? Oh, do they support Hezbollah? Do they support Hamas? Yes. Who do you think the Saudis support in various proxy wars and what have you? So, they're just doing what a middle power surrounded by hostile states would do. They're not the biggest sponsor of state terrorism. And I'm including in that the attacks on the Israeli embassy and the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in the 1990s under a fairly radical Iranian regime while the Ayatollah Khomeini was still alive. Now, I mean, and then let's not even get into white nationalist supremacists and their terrorist acts during the teens and
Mm.
into the 2020s. So that's bogus too. Okay, that's bogus. Plus, Israel has eliminated a lot of Iran's capability to support its proxies and engage in covert, discrete gray area wars, right? It's, neither black or white, it's in between. The Israelis are the most effective at that. And that includes wiping out all sorts of Revolutionary Guard commanders and that sort of thing. And so then they come up with the idea of regime change.
Well,
We
that went
needed
well
them.
for them in the last 30 years or decades or whatever.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, and
Yeah.
here, this is
What
where I'm
happened to
going to get into.
Condoleezza Rice's attitude at the end of her time in the Bush administration, was saying regional solutions for regional problems. What
Yeah.
happened to
Well, I
that?
mean,
Long
yeah.
ago.
Now, well, here's the thing. They have no interest in regime change. They actually have an interest in doing a Venezuela. They want to remove the guys they say are the bad guys, and they have done that, right? They got rid of Khamenei and the president, various commanders. But they want to find someone they can negotiate with in order to get, voila, Iranian oil. I mean, all of a sudden, there's the same strategic asset that Trump seems to have a fetish for. So, but it's all BS. And it shows this ahistoricism, this ignorance. Let me put it this way, and I'm not saying this as a former transitologist who has studied the transitions to democracy and actually did that work in the Clinton administration. The only time a defeat in war is followed by not the return, but the emergence of a democracy is in a country that is defeated in a war of annihilation, i.e., post-World War II Germany, post-World War II Japan, and you know what had to happen to those two countries for them to change their stripes. In every other instance of limited warfare, that is something that is less than a war of annihilation, particularly in regions that have no history of democracy whatsoever. What you get after foreign occupation and defeat in war is just another dictatorship. It just will be more friendly to the occupiers than the previous one that got them to become adversaries in the first place. So, what we see is, I don't want to say they're all imbeciles, but people in Washington actually saying that the son of the former Shah, Reza Pahlavi, is the prime candidate to return to Iran from his mansion in Beverly Hills and lead the Iranians to democracy. I mean, this is a pipe dream. I mean, this is a bad joke that the Pahlavis, that fake dynasty that was imposed by the CIA and MI6 when they overthrew the elected government installed in 1953. I mean, people think Iranians hate the West and the Yanks for no good reason. No, they got plenty of good reasons. And so this regime stuff is not serious at all. So the Americans are scrambling around to find excuses, and now they're starting to scramble around to find a reason to quit. But there's a major fly in the ointment. The fly in the ointment is Bibi Netanyahu. Now, I will say this. Hamas terribly miscalculated the Israeli response. You and I have discussed, it was obviously a sucker ploy to get the Israelis to overreact and world opinion would turn on them. And for a while, that happened. Well, what they didn't realize is that for a very long time now, in various Zionist and pro-Zionist think tanks, there has been this dream of creating a greater Israel. An Israel that has buffer zones around it, the way the Russians like their buffer zone. Yeah. And it's not a coincidence, to my mind, that a lot of the people who push the Israeli version of Lebensraum, which is living space that the Germans coined, but the Russians have adapted, a lot of those people are Russian Jewish in origin. They're immigrants. And the idea is we're going to take parts of southern Lebanon. We're going to take parts of Syria. We are going to take parts of Jordan. And we are going to destroy Iran so that it becomes just a series of ethnic enclaves. And they can quarrel amongst themselves, but they'll never pose a threat to us again. And October the 7th gave them that excuse. They looked at that and said, yeah, we'll take out Hamas. But you know what? We're going to keep on going.
And in my year, they've got Donald Trump. The opportunity starts to come in alignment. If we look at Israel actions relating to big theatre conflict, irrespective of its illegalities, the common thing is opportunity. We saw that last year in the and with the US partnering in the bombing of Iran. We saw this with Gaza. We have seen this opportunity with respect to settlers. We've seen this with the incursions into southern Lebanon and striking deep into the heart of Lebanon's civilian populations. So what I've brought up on the map here, Paul, is this. I've brought the map up not to speak to the map, but just to illustrate that Israel does appear to be driving ahead with what it would wish to achieve as buffer zones all around it. Some would say it's a land grab of opportunistic tendencies. Others, perhaps inside Israel, would say, well, it's a security purpose behind this. What do you make of that on those kind of grounds, Paul?
Well, I want to believe that inside of Israel there are rational people, and some versions of my past, I've actually interacted with Mossad leaders and senior IDF officials, again, years ago. They're very rational people, cold as stones. And I think, okay, for them, the idea of having buffer zones actually is legit. They're like, we're tired of being harassed, suffering a death by 1,000 cuts by Iranian proxies and other people who don't like us, either because we're Jews or because we're just in the middle and we're mostly Europeans, rather than Arabs or Persians or others of that sort. I think there's sincerity there. We just need to create buffer space, and if they're sharing strategic readings with the Russians and going back to the old Germans, because it wasn't just the Nazis who thought of this notion of a greater Germany in living space. It was the Wehrmacht, the German army, thought that would be a good idea for their continental aspirations. So I can see
the other thing too that came out of that idea inside of Germany, that it had been hard done by in the wake of World War One. That territories that were purely German had been taken from it, and it argued that this is its response to that. Now, we know in politics, particularly geopolitics, a convenient explanation for aggression is often landed upon. But even that is different from the point of view of compulsion by way of Israel being a state that was created in response to the atrocities of World War II, looking to expand its borders.
Right, but remember that grievance is one of the currencies of expansionism.
Yeah.
Right, you got to gripe about something, and so that's very typical. But what's happened here is whatever the sincerity of people deep inside Israeli security circles, and again, I have no doubt there are the opportunists like Bibi Netanyahu, who see this now is a strategic justification for a diversion. Again, for him, it's all about saving his own skin, using his people and the stupidity of the United States administration, because they can't accomplish their greater Israel goals without the backing of the U.S., and they definitely cannot defeat Iran without the U.S. getting involved. And so a lot of the bombing of civilians in and around Tehran, those are Israeli bombers. Those are Israeli missiles. They're taking advantage because the Yanks are extremely worried about the PR aspect to this. Wiping out a bunch of schoolgirls with a Tomahawk missile fired from a U.S. destroyer or submarine is not a good look.
And then trying to deny it until it becomes, in their view, irrelevant. Really.
Yeah. And there's two aspects to that that are interesting, but let me finish. So Bibi's playing Trump and trying to drag him further. Now he's trying to drag him into troops on the ground scenario.
Yeah.
Because that'll bog them down for months. And Netanyahu doesn't really care if the MAGA administration, in the midterms loses its congressional support and then gets wiped out in 20. They don't care. They want a bigger space and become the the irresistible object or the unmovable object in the middle of the Levant. That's their idea. Now, here's where things get, positively crazy. Um, this administration, under this doddering fool of a president, it's all about theater and performance. And I'll just explain what I mean by this. Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump together, they'd be a comedy team if it wasn't so tragic. Pete Hegseth literally flexes when he's at the podium talking about the war. I mean, I think he gets sexually excited talking about the war. And I thought to myself, watching one of these demonstrations, these performances, you know what? He and Trump are like two little boys playing with their G.I. Joe toy soldiers in the sandbox. They're knocking them over. If they're a Buchanan male, they'll put a firecracker under one of the toy tanks and blow it sky high. I mean, they're, what little boys do.
Yeah.
And I think that's what these
Unfortunately,
guys,
it's a dangerous situation, and their
but
motivations are.
to them, the soldiers that they're willing to sacrifice are just the equivalent of toy soldiers in a sandbox. And so they're playing, and they're flexing. This is going to go terribly wrong. There are reports now. There were two carrier task groups sent over there. The Abraham Lincoln, which is in the outer Gulf of Oman and striking Iran. There was the Gerald Ford, the most modern aircraft carrier in the U.S. fleet. It's retreated to port in Croatia because of a fire that was started mysteriously in the laundry room, which then sent smoke throughout the ship, fouling its air conditioning units and whatnot. That was sabotage. That was done internally. And so that's basically a mutiny without declaring, tell me what's a mutiny without saying it out loud. So that tells us there's some morale issues, at least within the Navy. And it turns out the Ford, was at the end of a 9-month deployment. All right. So these young sailors have been at sea for 9 months. And now they've been told to go over and fight a war.
In New Zealand slang, they've had a gutful.
Very well said. They absolutely have. Now, they're not the only ones who've had a gutful. The ringing of Iran with U.S. bases in the Sunni Arab world, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, that was supposed to be a security guarantee. And what it's gotten them is missile fire. Yeah. They're getting hit. And yes, the Iranians are hitting. The point about the Iranians is they're hitting U.S. military bases. They're hitting the local military bases that may have U.S. troops stationed on them, or from which U.S. operations are directed at Iran, and they're hitting some civilian infrastructure. But they are deliberately avoiding civilian residential areas, hospitals, that sort of thing. In contrast, the Israeli approach is basically the same approach as they did to Gaza. Yeah. Except that Iran has a lot more military targets to deal with first. But they're now moving into what we call counter-value targeting. Counter-force targeting is, hard targets you kill because they can hurt you. Counter-value is you kill things that are precious to them. Yeah. And so killing civilians and children is counter-value, while the Israelis have moved now into that phase. The Yanks are doing a bit of a hybrid, but very reluctantly, I would argue. And so the divergence in strategies now is not just strategic, right? Bibi and the Greater Israel Project versus whatever's going through the heads of Hegseth and Trump. And at that point, the way they want to prosecute the war begins to diverge as well, although Bibi's logic is still the dominant logic in this partnership. He's gonna sucker the Americans into putting at least special forces
Yeah.
onto Karg Island and some of the
Yeah.
coastal defenses.
They
He's
they
gonna
almost they almost got to that in previous days prior to the weekend. Most recently, from what I could see, just a bit of a comparison here too. And I'm not trying to minimize in any way the tragic situation relating to the Iraq War back in the 2000s, but the comparison's interesting. We've seen during the height or the whole term of the Iraq invasion, Kuwait was reasonably safe. The UAE was reasonably safe. The airlines were moving in and moving out. Bahrain was reasonably safe. Oman was safe. I was in those countries during that period at different times for different assignments, not in the conflict of Iraq, I must say. Others like John Stevenson and others are far more experienced in that theatre. But my point here is all of those states. So what's that?
You travel in some good circles there, mate.
So with those states, so with those states, they were reasonably safe. Yet after the atrocities started to come out and the exposure of what was happening inside Iraq, there was a change in the tempo, shall we say, within the populations of places like Bahrain and that. And you would see on the walls sketches and spray painted, idiosyncratic to the young men that had gone to Iraq. And you ask the locals, what's this about? And they say, they're fallen martyrs, which is quite different to where the governments, the monarchistic type governments had been leaning. The populations are quite different. But my point here is this is chaos. These Gulf states have never experienced this type of chaos on their turf before. And one gets a sense that the message that is being sent from the Iranians is very simple. You Gulf states thought after you signed the accord that you had some form of progress, you had some form of security. Well, you don't. And look, you're not even being protected. So, Paul, back to you on that observation.
Yeah, and it helps us wrap up the second part of the discussion in that for the Iranians, and it goes back again. A lot of our listeners are well versed in this, but this gets back to the concept of asymmetric war. The one thing that the first Gulf War demonstrated is you don't fight a great power like the United States force on force. Stand up and go toe to toe. You'll get obliterated. But this time for real, not rhetorically. The best strategy for the Iranians was to broaden the war into the neighboring countries, to expand it into proxy gray area war, and to prolong it indefinitely because it has unlimited time horizons. The United States does not. It has those elections.
Yeah.
And so...
and also, I would argue on that point, the attention span of Trump. And now I think that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities on Israel's effort. And I think they're relying significantly on the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump. That does not seem to be solid ground, particularly when your whole Iron Dome defense and your intercept missile capabilities rely on the United States' generosity. And we know Trump is a transactionalist at best and certainly can't be reliable as a partner in such times of conflict if things aren't feeling right to him back home.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it's pretty clear that he's looking to throw Hegseth under the bus. He's already saying that this was all Hegseth's idea. And so, this is going to get very interesting in a hurry. But from the Iranian point of view, you see in our Western media, including that in New Zealand, the majority coverage is Iranians bad, the West good. And now there's a lot of doubt about Israel, self-inflicted doubt. A lot of people were sympathetic to Israel, no longer are. I'm one of them. Uh, the Iranians are playing the game the way they have to play in order to prevail. It's the weaker actor in an asymmetric war scenario has to go low, has to prolong it, make it a death by 1,000 cuts. The Viet Cong did this. The guerrilla warfare experiences that I am familiar with in Latin America, it was all about that. Get
Mm.
down and wear them down. Why?
Yeah,
Because, well, the reason is they're fighting an existential fight. And you and I have talked about, Persian culture and history. We're talking an 8,000-year-old culture fighting on their ancestral lands against foreign occupiers who are also different religions. It's like this: if you want an enemy, the Yanks make a perfect enemy. They're just very strong, at least at first.
mm.
And so if you wear them down, you wear them out. And so that's what the Iranians are doing. And I think I think they're keeping a lot of their powder dry. They
Well,
haven't
they've been
really activated.
preparing for many, many years, haven't they? And one of you've mentioned Vietnam a number of times. What comes to mind on that too, to support your idea on that, is bodies of work like Errol Morris's documentary, where he had Robert McNamara sitting there, basically quizzing him on this type of stuff. McNamara came through and he says, what we didn't realise is we didn't understand our enemy at all, what motivated them to be doing what they were doing inside their country. We thought we were in an ideological war. The Vietnamese were in a war that was taking their country back. They'd had decades and decades of colonial consequences. The French, they'd had enough of being guillotined out of existence. Then the English came in, the Americans are there, and it was, we want our country to be ours. It wasn't an ideological war at all. And so, I get a sense of what you were highlighting, and there is a situation where I don't see any evidence in looking at this deeply that the United States actually understands why all of those factions who have suffered under the hands of the Iranian regime are not rising up to the bait of this. Well, the one, they're not armed. And secondly, it's not the United States' country to do a deal with them with. And one gets a sense that this could go on for a very long time as Iran identifies once again with perhaps its true self. So with that said, Paul, we are looking at a situation that may outrun Trump's leadership. It may outrun MAGA's hold on the White House. What does that look like in that type of future space?
All right, let me just say one thing before I go on to that, because I did want to talk about possible upsides to all of this. But
Yeah.
let's be very clear. Unless you are a child, ignorance is not bliss. In the real world, ignorance is very, very counterproductive. And ahistoricism, that is attacking countries not knowing their history, not knowing their character. I am a student of what is known as war cultures. So the Arabs fight a certain way, the Chinese fight a certain way, the Europeans fight a certain way. The Americans think everything is about mass and technological advantages, but other countries put a primacy on stealth, mobility, subterfuge, that sort of thing. Well, these, I run out of insults talking about these guys. They don't care about Persian culture or Persian fighting culture. They don't know. And if there is an expert trying to tell them, they're not listening. They're not listening to who they're going up against. And if Bibi Netanyahu is the one you're listening to, well, he's feeding you a pack of lies. They clearly thought that the Iranians, after you decapitated, you took out Khamenei, they'd roll over. And it's like, no, they have cadres and cadres of replacement leaders ready to go. And most of them are more hardline than the former senior leader because they haven't been exposed to the art of compromise with other countries and that sort of thing. So this gross ignorance is
Yeah.
leading them by the nose into what is going to become a strategic disaster that makes W. Bush's eras in invading Iraq in particular look like child's play. Mark my words. Now, I thought when you and I started talking about this show, I thought, can we rescue anything from this mess? Because, it's just horror show. And I thought, actually, there is. And you and I have talked a little bit via email. And so let me run down, and if listeners want to weigh in, they can. Okay, what can we rescue that's a positive from this, right? Well, the first one is the world is pushing back at the bullies. Europe is not coming to Trump's aid. Asia is not coming. In fact, no one's coming to Trump's aid. And in fact, some countries are cutting deals with the Iranians to allow safe passage of oil to their home ports.
Their flagship.
So we're pushing back at not New Zealand. New Zealand, unfortunately, is bending over, but other countries, significant countries, are saying thanks but no thanks. And I think it was the German chancellor who said it well. The German defense minister said, "This isn't our war. Period. Full stop. Not our war." So that's the FU theory applied to Trump by the rest of the world. Yay, that's a positive.
And Germany has a history in this. When George W. Bush was wanting a coalition to be built around those northern European powerhouse states, Germany and France said, no, thank you. We're not. This is not our war. We do not see any advantage of us getting involved. And that must have made the Bush administration's trajectory into that conflict extremely difficult. And so this is a big deal, isn't it?
It's a very big deal. But and remember, one of the reasons is that even though a lot of other powers had serious misgivings about the invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, NATO cobbled up coalitions that New Zealand participated in as a partner of the NATO alliance. And so we had Europeans fighting alongside Americans in both of those conflicts, even though the leadership really didn't want to, okay? In this one, they've just said a flat no. They're not getting involved with this one because they see it for what it is. It's a war of aggression. People say war of opportunity. Well, if you strike first because the moment is ripe, you're the aggressor. You're not defending anything. And when you do 5,000 miles to go do it, I'd say that's textbook aggression. Now, that's the first upside, is the world is pushing back. That leads to the second upside, which it is now clear that the unipolar moment is finished. And we're moving now to a multipolar or perhaps poly-centric international system.
And once again, can you talk about that polycentric? I think it's very important.
Yeah, polycentrism is a word. It's I didn't coin the phrase. It actually came from other international relations scholars, and it basically means when you say multipolar or unipolar or bipolar, the reference is to magnetic poles. So let's say the North and South poles. Things are attracted to them. Things are grouped around them because of the weight of the pull of the pole, whoever that may be, the Soviet Union, the US, during the Cold War. In this instance, the move to polycentrism is because there is not necessarily a magnetic attraction, a compulsion, where you have to go with one of these great powers. Instead, it's almost as if it was a marriage of convenience. You pick and choose who you ally with, depending on the subject.
And perhaps we've seen this in trade relationships, right? So it's not that long ago that a small country like New Zealand was embracing two-way trade with Iran. even though Iran had obviously its differences with others in that tight Five Eyes intelligence sharing community. You see New Zealand on trade issues. I'm just using New Zealand as an example here of this. Finding self-interest that it attaches or layers on top of common ground to get things happening. New Zealand was the first to embark on, really, and under Phil Goff's leadership in the Clark administration here, with a free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China. We had a former Prime Minister, albeit for a very short time, Mike Moore, leading the WTO at the time, which paved the way for People's Republic's membership of that global body. This is a kind of thing of, it comes under criticism, doesn't it? From the point of view of hypocrisies. You talk about like-minded countries, and yet here you are on issues of trade, getting relationships deeper with ones that are outside perhaps your supposed like-minded countries. Well, now we've got a different kettle of fish in the world's order. How does this kind of shape this idea? I'm trying to give a comparison, give a visual perhaps from a comparison point of view. How does that kind of work now exactly?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned before, this is the end of an era. The U.S. primacy will be no longer. It'll be a great power for a while more. But I eventually think it's going to start fracturing internally because its polity is deeply divided. One of the arguments about great powers and projecting power is that you have to have a unified national vision of where you are in the world as a nation.
That transcends elections, that reaches beyond, like
right.
a common national identity, if you like. Yeah.
Correct. And often there's a foundational myth and all that, but the U.S. no longer has that. Okay, the U.S. is a deeply, deeply divided country, and that's weakening it. No opponent, no external enemy will come in and defeat it. It's going to defeat itself. Whether it has a civil war or not, I don't know, but U.S. is definitely in decline, and it may not be visible to our American friends. You sit out where we sit, and it's pretty clear. This place is Rome before the fall. Now, how is this a good thing? And I say it's because we're moving to multipolarity and poly-centrism. Now, among the poly-centrism are two aspects. The first is this is going to be the first real test of supply chain resilience since the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the alternative supply chain systems, the networks, nearshoring, friendshoring, all that sort of stuff is now being put to the test.
And your comment about those ships getting right of passage, this is perhaps an applied example of this, yeah?
Yeah, they're just paying tolls. I mean, the Iranians are diverting shipping. And those who want to go close to the Iranian court, and they literally have a toll gate between two small islands. And I don't know what the amount is, but let's say, for the sake of argument, they take $1 million per ship to allow them safe passage to the refineries further north, to and from. That's a transaction. That's business. It has nothing to do with ideology. And a lot of countries are going, yeah, we can do it. Now, think of it this way. I mean, not that New Zealand is a good example, but in thinking about supply chain resilience and the test, that now you no longer source production all in one place. You make sure you have various hubs and whatnot. It turns out New Zealand, remarkably, its non-transportation related energy costs are 80% covered by hydro, solar, and wind. We don't depend on fossil fuels for everything other than transportation.
And that's different to the Australian experience. The Australians, they've got their coal, and perhaps with the coal, they've got a bargaining chip geopolitically as well, or geoeconomically, and saying, you get no coal if you don't cough up with your crude. New Zealand, the infrastructure, but then without getting down into the New Zealand politics, the current government, which has modelled itself, I would argue, on many elements of a Trump type of administration in the commercial sector kind of situation, has right at the beginning, within its first 100 days of office, had got rid of subsidies relating to electric vehicles, had whacked on for a right-leaning economic liberal government. It whacked on tax onto that sector, where user tax for every 1,000 kilometres travelled in an EV, you have to cough up around $80 to $88 for that privilege. Now, there are arguments for that, but what I'm saying is that at a time where New Zealand could become even more with its vehicle fleet, and certainly its commercial fleets, into an area of self-dependency, self-sufficiency, the current government has obviously failed in the extreme. So, sometimes we see things like, New Zealand's got all of this capacity to be energy reliant. The renewable energy sector here in New Zealand is through necessity driving ahead, held back by government policies. But I just wanted to add that little scope into New Zealand's weirdness when it comes to such things.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have a particularly retrograde government at the moment, and quite frankly, I mean, you wouldn't get offended because we've talked about this. The talent pool, the political talent pool in New Zealand's pretty friggin' thin.
Yeah.
And these guys are just emulating Trump and other conservatives. They're still talking about neoliberalism. And so it is what it is. But smarter politicians have thought about resilience in other ways, alternatives. And I was struck by a non-politician. I heard an interview, I can't remember his name, but there was a guy who was like the logistics manager, let's say, for Maersk, the big shipping company.
Yep.
And he said after the pandemic, what they've decided is they invested it heavily in cargo aircraft. And they're looking into electric trucks and that sort of thing, because they realized that closing off any major chokeway, not just the Strait of Hormuz, but think of the Straits of Malacca. Singapore is a major refining hub. And so he goes, we've moved quickly for particularly high-tech type cargoes into aircraft. And yes, it's still burning fuel, but a lot less fuel than a tanker. Yeah. And so that's a small step. But the other part of it, and again, we're going to see the resilience if there is. I mean, it may turn out people just went back to doing the same old thing and they're going to get hammered. But the other part of this is that Trump has handed a gift to the global South and the BRICS, as well as the very international institutions that he's always bad-mouthing. Because institutions like the EU, institutions like, even the UN, have realized that as you well said, with the US as a rogue country, right? You can't rely on these guys. In fact, they got a lunatic running the place. It's time to reform and seriously reform the way they do things. And that means bringing in the global South.
Yeah.
And so
ironically, the call for multilateralism and tidy up reform is the strongest voices are coming from the global South nations.
Yeah, but you know what? Now the global North is answering. I noticed that the World Bank or the World Trade Organization, I'm not sure which one, I think probably the WTO, they're having their annual conference. And the current president of the WTO basically said at the general plenary that they're going to have to reform their rules and procedures to bring in voices from the global South, that they can no longer dictate institutional policy regarding trade from the vantage point of the North.
Yep.
This is really huge. Significant. Yep. And so the own goal aspect to what Trump is doing it can't be, you know, overemphasized. I mean, this guy is single-handedly reducing the United States in stature and power. And if I was a conspiracy theorist, I'd go, who benefits from all of this other than the global South doing so inadvertently, since he doesn't like them? He calls them bad names. Putin, Putin, and to some extent, President Xi in China. And that's an interesting thing about rising powers and lowering powers. As part of our discussions about transitions, it's always the declining power that starts major wars, and they get defeated. The ascending powers, they don't start wars. They just bide their time because they're growing and growing and growing. That's China.
Mm.
Sure, they have skirmishes in the South China Sea, but that's kindergarten stuff. Yeah, the axiom that's the declining power that starts a war that leads to its defeat and its demise. Holy moly. When I saw Russia invade Ukraine, I thought, okay, this is Putin thinking about Tsarist Russia and trying to reclaim the Russian Empire. He's going down.
Mm.
But it took an American to do him one better. It's one of those hold my beer moments where Trump looks over and goes, "Oh, you want to see a guy take a country down faster? Just look at me." And he's gone off into this venture. And the U.S. is going to pay a price for this, but trying to be positive from an international perspective, I think the good that's going to come out of this is it's going to revitalize the institutional structure of the international community.
So
Because
what
the US
visually what this looks like to me, what you're arguing, sorry, what it looks like to me is like the pendulum has swung so far into lawlessness that the expectation of the global South nations and these institutions, and one could argue some of the European states, that they anticipate that pendulum is going to come back, and it's going to be coming back swift through necessity. And so the work on making sense of this as equilibrium comes, if you look at it from a visual point of view, is starting to show up. And this sounds like what you were positioning here and arguing here as one of the positives. Paul, before we look at what a foreign policy may look like out of the ashes of this nonsense, this tragedy, this rogue breach of indiscriminate illegal acts by way of the dominant Western nation and its friend, shall we say, in the Middle East. Before we look at those foreign policies and how other administrations may approach it, I've got a couple of things that have come in here. Tamatero Curtis, he says, I'll bring it up on screen actually, bring it up there. From a foreign policy perspective, how could New Zealand respond to Trump's aggressiveness without angering the Trump administration to the point of obliteration? I think he has hit on something that we've seen the fawning around Trump. We've seen how that hasn't worked. New Zealand's a smaller country, but the world is full of small countries. How do they react to this? Keeping their long, hard identities perhaps intact without attracting the aggression. Even one of my brother-in-laws brought this up in a text to me overnight, that how does New Zealand address itself when these major powers that used to be partners have gone rogue in a illegal sense?
Well, the specific question about New Zealand, I think, has two sides to the answer. The first one is the New Zealand government has to get its act together in terms of how it wants to play Trump. The approach so far, but not just by New Zealand, has been to kiss his rear end. Appease him, flatter him, give him a medal, give him a fake prize, but basically kiss his rear. That doesn't work. As everybody knows, Appeasing a bully just begets more bullying. And we're seeing it now. I mean, that's the one good thing. I got a 12-year-old boy. We're looking at Trump. I'm using Trump as an example of everything that's bad in the world and said, this guy's going to get his comeuppance. It's just a matter of time. That time's arriving. But we have a foreign minister who is big on appeasing Trump. In fact, his political party is doing a little MAGA New Zealand light over here, trying the national populist crap. And then the real center right, not the populist right, where the guys with the prime minister, they don't know where they are. They just want to make sure they stay out of trouble, get off the radar screen. So I would say to them, well, if you want to stay out of Trump's sights, and you know that your foreign minister is full of it, make better friends with Asian countries, with Latin American countries. Go for that global South role. We're in the South. There are places that certainly will be bad is that MAGA manages to hold on to Congress in November. Things get worse under Trump. He starts another war, and things deteriorate to the point of then having a really big war with a big power that even if it's a tie, will set the world back a quarter century in terms of its developmental repercussions and whatnot, because that'll be a war that'll be fought with AI, with robotics, nightmare. Okay, so MAGA wins, nightmare ensues. On the other hand, and I'm confident this is going to happen, the Democrats will win at least one of the houses of Congress in November, hopefully both. But that makes Trump a lame duck, one way or the other. And more importantly, rather than doing the Democrat thing, which is to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, they get their act together. They realize that playing this centrist role to a fanatical right wing, such as MAGA, is a loser's strategy. They need to go center left, but sincere center left, tell their corporate sponsors, the liberal corporate types, say, look, we need tax relief for the middle and lower classes and not for the billionaires. I mean, you guys are just going to have to suck it up. And here's the most important part for this part of the discussion. Our foreign policy, I say ours, the US foreign policy, has to change because we've got to reverse a lot of the damage that this guy has done, but it starts with Israel. We got to put distance on Israel. And the Israeli lobby in the States is very strong. And again, it's not made up of Jews, it's made up mostly of evangelical Christians. And we just apply the FU theory to them and go, you know what? This tag wags the dog syndrome has now gotten way out of hand.
Yeah, because you can pick up in the United States that there's been a generational shift in play. We've seen that. The other thing globally, if elections show us anything, and that's something you used before, the word just a few minutes ago, is when a candidate is authentic, they are real and they mean it and they detail that authenticity in their campaign, the public responds to that authenticity. One could say that the public has had enough of this nonsense and charade from both past Democrat candidates in the United States. It's a bit presumptuous of me to suggest this from so far away, but one would argue, and I'd argue very strongly, that the Democrats have been as bad as the Republicans on their presentation not being authentic, shall we say. So you look at Mamdani's successes in New York. Who would ever have thought that a person like Mamdani in this day and age would get through? Authentic campaigning seems to have won. We see it around the world. Just wanted to raise that type of observation back up there, Paul.
No, that's a very good one. Of course, Mamdani, his electoral demographic is rather unique. Whether he translates into nationwide, voting in his favor is a whole other thing. I don't think he's going to fly in Central Texas.
No.
Just but given the electoral college and whatnot, he could be a national candidate at some point. But there's others. This guy Tallarico from Texas, has won the Democratic primary for Senate. We'll see if he defeats the incumbent dude.
And just a
There
quick
is,
thing, if the Democrats went for Newsom or someone like that, is that a failure or is that a way forward?
well, again, compared to what we got on the right wing side, anything's a move forward. I'm not a big fan of Newsom because there's too much of that establishment, centrist, corporate thing behind him. Sure, he's telegenic and he's got an interesting history, but we need regenerational change, but we need ideological change. I mean, again, labor here in New Zealand's got to do a lot of that too. They got to return to their working class roots. Remember, the Democrats are the party of the people, and the contrast now is so visible that Trump caters to the 1% and does bad things to the rest of us. And they've got to play that card, and they're still reluctant. You got to get rid of Chuck Schumer. You've got to get rid of that whole posse of geriatrics who dominate. And, the Clintons. The Clintons got to go. Obama is useful as a symbolic leader and an orator. Rally the crowds, but keep him away from policy because he was the last of the Clintonian Biden types who actually did anything. Biden, of course, was old generation. They got to go. We need 50-year-olds. We need 40-year-olds in the Democratic Party. I'd stake my bet on them than any of this geriatric crowd. And they've got their first opportunity to do so in the next 7 months. There's going to be a flurry of primaries. We can start seeing candidates come through at the congressional level. And then there'll always be people with aspirations thinking about 2028. And remember, in the meantime, there's going to be diversions. There's going to be deflections. The MAGA administration is going to, there was a book written by Nikki Hager, an investigative journalist here in New Zealand. For those of you who don't know, I'm a very good investigative journalist, and he wrote a book called Dirty Politics, which was about all the skullduggery that is inside of New Zealand politics. We're not as clean as we try to say we are. And there's going to be a lot of dirty politics in the United States. It's going to, again, make us look like a sandbox. And the Dems have to be prepared for that, right? It's time to be able, forget the the gentleman's dueling rules, and let's get down to Street Fighter mode because that's where the Republicans are going. And they're going to come with their chains and their brass knuckles. And I'm not saying that the Democrats have to play dirty, but they have to see what's coming at them in order to effectively counter them. If they do that, and the Democrats win in Congress and then win the presidency in 2028, first order of business, distance from Israel. I mean, as cut off the spigot of financial aid and weapons, cut it off.
Just on that point, as we head to wrapping this up, maybe if you can read that question here from Tim first. And Tim, thank you for your comments through this episode.
Distance from Israel. He's someone from Herat.
Yeah, Tim is quoting Gideon Levy from Herat, he's saying said the next US president will distance from Israel. How likely is that to happen with the dependency they both have on each other? I think in part you've answered that, but let's start to wrap up with some of these ideas because this is intrinsic to the whole episode.
Yeah, Tim, I don't think that the U.S. is as dependent on Israel as many people think. The Israeli lobby would like you to think that the U.S. depends on them, and certainly Israel is the center of the Western-oriented intelligence net system in the Middle East. Everything starts with Mossad and its tributary agencies. Uh, that's true. But distancing ourselves, Five Eyes, I'm thinking of, from Israel in a military sense. So you're no longer supporting them punishing other people who have nothing to do with the decision making of leaders of, let's say, Hamas or Hezbollah. These are innocent civilians, and we are providing, again, the Anglophone world, Israel with the instruments by which to punish them. You cut
And
them
murder
off.
and commit arguably, allegedly genocide on a whole race of
Yeah.
people.
Well, I think there's no doubt about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm tired mincing words.
Yeah,
When
me
the
too. I put
yeah,
that there as an ironic statement, the alleged. Don't get me wrong here. Yeah.
no. I mean, it's when the war first started, we were like, well, the Israelis, they're going to do some nasty stuff, but they're going to keep it within the rules. And no, forget that.
Mm.
And again, it has to do with this greater Israel logic and all that sort of stuff. But I think you can say to the Israelis, look, you have your enough stuff. You produce your own weapons. And so we're cutting you off. Now, if you want to cut us off from intelligent flows, it works both ways, buddy.
Mm.
You depend on us. Five Eyes feeds Israel. I mean, I don't know how many New Zealanders are aware of that, but there's reciprocity between what are called the Five Eyes partners or friends, right? So the alliance system is the five Anglophone countries, but Singapore is a Five Eyes partner, Israel, foremost Five Eyes partner. They get our intelligence flows. And sure, we filter a little bit of it, but we provide them with a lot of early warning, as they do for us. So you say to the Israelis, look, you guys are pragmatists. Enough is enough. You make your own weapons if you want to go keep on killing civilians, right? We can't do anything about that. You know how to copy F-16s. You know how to copy Tomahawks. We gave you all that stuff. You reverse engineered it. Can't say anything about that anymore, but we're not giving you any more money, and we're certainly not selling you any more weapons. I think the Israelis will go, well, it was a nice ride while it lasted, but now it's time to, rein it in.
Yeah.
I think it's very pragmatic. I just don't see them
And
freaking out.
pragmatic. What if there is a sensible generational shift in countries like these smaller ones around the world that have engagement with Israel? New Zealand, we use New Zealand again as an example here. Maybe future and very near governments in New Zealand will make a call on our energy aspirational goals and say to the Israelis, we no longer welcome you into New Zealand's space in the renewable geothermal energy expertise that you have contributed to this country. We frankly do not want to do business with your businesses anymore. So all of your interests that you have in the central North Island volcanic plateau, for example, thank you, but we have companies here in New Zealand like McConnell Dowell, who's been pushed out in past years from being able to successfully tender for such innovations. You're no longer welcome here. And perhaps once countries actually wake up to the new generation that is taking power in these places, then there may be some change that starts to occur, because the realities are Israel cannot defend itself without its massive big brother, the United States. It cannot trade its way into prosperity. IP is not a sound and sensible way to secure future generations' prosperity and security in a country that is surrounded in the way it is created. On that note, Paul, I'll pass it back to you to wrap up. And it's been a great episode, I think. And we've got some very... you and I are not one for flattery, but I'm going to bring up a few here. They're really good. And Barbara Thomas, she pointed out earlier on that the map that we were bringing out was out of focus. And I think that's a resolution issue that as things are going live into YouTube, it's not at our end. We can see the detail very, very clearly, but at YouTube, it does a standard definition first. And then once it's on demand, it cranks up its thing. So its resolution. So that should be fine. Barbara, thank you for that comment. Tim, you brought a great question to the program, and you put this wonderful bit of encouragement there. Brilliant. I love this podcast. Thank you for that. And also to Tamatere Curtis, so glad you guys are back. I've been missing these kinds of conversations from a New Zealand perspective. You're very welcome, and I know Paul feels the same. So thank you to all of that. Paul, over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, no, that's what we're here for. We're trying to give it, an angle from down here. Okay, I'll finish with one thing. One, just as in answer to what you were just saying about Israel and its trade connections. Most pointedly, we should stop New Zealand companies like Raycon from selling weapons guidance systems to the Israelis. That's still going on. And so a lot of these missiles that are fired have New Zealand componentry. We got to stop that now, period. And that would be that there's a general suggestion that stems from that. Let all fair-minded countries stop any supplies into the Israeli kill chain so long as they continue to behave this way. Make them feel what it's like to be a pariah state, because they're not going to stop unless the world reacts to them. And see, right now they say, oh, but you're doing this to us because you hate Jews. The Muslim world, treats Israel very badly. And I think it's shameful that they do. But this one is a universal cause where we're like, no, it has nothing to do with your ethnicity or religion. It has a lot to do with your behavior. And if the Americans back off, see, that's why it's like a two-sequence thing. Democrats win. Americans back off of this unqualified support for genocide, allows Israel to pull the United States into a war of aggression. I mean, come on. And we say enough is enough. Then smaller countries will rediscover their spines, will rediscover their independence and their integrity, and will say, you know what, we're not going to trade. We're going to start with anything related to weapons, and then we'll start thinking about more general trade. We've had this discussion in our house. We use a system called Soda Stream to put gas into basic water, so I have fizzy water. That's Israeli. Well, in the Buchanan-Nichols household, there are no more Soda Stream. Okay, that stopped 2 years ago.
Yeah. The consumer boycott.
We're just not doing it. Okay, and yes, it doesn't matter. We're out in the back blocks of the Waitakeries, but we're like, hey, it eases our conscience to know that our money is not winding up.
Yeah,
in the hands of these
and there's nothing anti-Semitic about that. It's a response, to take the BDS movement and claim it's an anti-Semitic empowered organization or movement is just ridiculous. It's a response to the atrocities, and that's the end of it. Paul, thank you for today's episode. We're just coming up to an hour and a half, and so we've got a month's worth of good dialogue there, and we just want to say to those that have been there throughout this podcast or have joined us during it, thank you very much for your time and your investment of your time. It is precious, and we very much appreciate that. We will be back again in April. Paul will announce exactly when on his social media networks and other networks, and so keep an eye out for that. And as always, sign up if you can, if this has been meaningful for you, and I'd imagine that those that have hung out to the end, it has been, that sign up to follow us on YouTube, because you'll get an alert, basically. So that'll be good. Give us a thumbs up too, because that helps with the algorithms as well. Until we see you again, take care out there, ka kite anō, and we look forward to your company once again.